and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Wednesday is the second day of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Portugal, which is the very last stop of his 9-day tour abroad. In the past couple of days, he paid state visits to Spain, Argentina, Panama, and attended the G20 Leaders Summit in Buenos Aires. Let's take a look at some of the most important achievements of the trip.
Strengthening bilateral ties. President Xi's first stop marks the first visit to Spain by a Chinese leader in 13 years, coincidentally on the 45th anniversary of diplomatic ties. Argentina appears to be more familiar to Xi, as this was his second time setting foot in the country. Panama is unique in that this is the very first visit of any Chinese president after the two countries established diplomatic ties last year. And Portugal marks the first visit by a Chinese president in 8 years. With bilateral ties sealed by deals, China, together with partners supporting multilateralism, set the tone for G20 meetings in Buenos Aires. Xi put forward 4 suggestions on boosting the world economy. First, committing to openness and cooperation while upholding the multilateral trading system. Second, forging strong partnership and stepping up macro policy coordination. Third, committing to innovation and create new momentum for growth. And last but not least, upholding win-win cooperation and promoting inclusive global development. In a joint declaration, leaders agreed on working towards strengthening fair and sustainable development and keeping strong global economic growth while improving a rule-based international order. One of the highlights of Xi's tour is the truce in the trade war between China and the US. During a working dinner, President Xi and Trump, along with their delegations, agreed to stop imposing new tariffs on January the 1st. They also decided to step up negotiations toward eliminating all other tariffs. While supporters of globalization are fighting hard against protectionism, the Belt and Road Initiative is again echoed by China's partners. Portuguese President expressed his expectations on improving economic cooperation with China, and China's reiterated in various occasions its stances on continuing reforms and opening up.
For more on the G20 Summit analysis and of Chinese President Xi Jinping's 4-nation tour, joining us in Beijing, Victor Gaojikai, Chinese international relations expert, current affairs commentator. In Washington, D.C., Saurabh Gupta, a senior Asia-Pacific international relations policy specialist at the Institute for China-American Studies. In Brussels, Peter Klepp, who is the head of the Brussels office for Open Europe. I want to welcome the 3 of you gentlemen for joining us. First of all, going to you, Mr. Gao, one of the things is the G20 summit, of course, with, not without, but with a joint declaration. Many important points in it, even though we're a little bit far away from that day when they signed the agreement. But many of the points is going to be with us for a long time. For example, WTO, the World Trade Organization, the reform of it, according to the statement, is, quote, necessary reform. How should we understand it?
Well, first of all, we would congratulate the successful conclusion of the G20 in Buenos Aires, and I think the Argentinian host did a wonderful job in pulling off this successful joint communique. Secondly, talking about the reform of the WTO, of course, it's highly necessary. Why? Because the circumstances in the world trade and economic development have changed greatly, and the WTO, within its 4 corners of the envelope, really need to do major reform to accommodate the dynamics in the world today. And I think by promoting the reform of the WTO, all the countries participating in promoting the reform expect to benefit from the more lean and efficient WTO going forward.
Lean and efficient, those are the adjectives you use. According to you, Mr. Gupta, how should we understand the quote-unquote necessary reform? How will that, in a way, be able to bring more players on board?
The WTO is a difficult body to reform because it operates by consensus and it has 160 members. That said, there is an understanding within the membership that the WTO rules, which were set up in the mid-1990s, were new and fresh then but are not new and fresh today. in areas such as digital trade, in areas such as investment policy. The WTO really is not a player, and this is an area where there has been significant development in the years since. And so the WTO is now, there are working groups which are now trying to tackle these issues. The three main areas, I think, where the WTO is, or some of the areas where the WTO is trying to look at reforming is, A, to have greater transparency within the organization.
Okay.
You know, countries are late in providing notifications about their subsidies, etc., etc. That's an easy ask, and that can be done. A second area is with regard to the dispute settlement system, which is the jewel in the crown of the WTO, but which the US is holding up, and US is the only party holding up. So at this G20 summit, we saw the BRICS countries and the G20 put out a proposal on how to reform the appellate body, and the US, I hope, will engage with the process now. And finally, and this is going to be the hardest part, is updating the negotiating arm of the WTO. Now, the WTO, as I said, works by consensus, and people realize that they need to move the ball forward in reform in terms of the negotiations, but it requires every party to give something. You can't have huge asks at the table, but then say, oh, other people need to lead, and I cannot do this, and I will make my compromise last. So that is going to be a hard ask, but I think the WTO realizes it is going to get outdated in that regard.
Okay, Martin Redrado, he's coming to us also in Buenos Aires. He's the chairman of the Foundation Capital and Economic Think Tank over there. It's good to see you, Mr. Redrado. Of course, the G20 Summit wrapped up in Argentina, but the thing is not just about the summit itself, but rather the joint declaration, its impact for months and probably years on the world. After all, Mr. Redrado, this statement is coming out after the APEC failed to reach any joint statement among its members. So how should we understand the significance of it, and also particularly the reform of the WTO? Remember, the phrase is, once again, the so-called necessary reform.
It is critical what I heard from the ministers that I talked to during the G20, that we were able in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, to create a mood that made it possible to have a final declaration, which was different what happened in APEC and in the G7 meeting. So it was clear that we needed to leave room for constructive ambiguities, and yes, in fact, what it has mandated the WTO to reform itself, I think we should take it with care. Unfortunately, the world is not in the line of multilateralism as middle countries like ourselves or other emerging economies believe in, and also Europe and China. But there's one significant player that wants to be playing the game of bilateralism. So in my view, the reform of the WTO we should take at a slow path, because any major reform that we'll do would last for the next 50 years. So in my view, we should strengthen the appellate body, which is, I'm a panel member of the WTO, because the dispute settlement unit is probably the most effective system that we have worldwide to resolve differences among member countries.
Right. The appellate body, of course, once again become the key words. Having said that, though, it is not the only issue that the world is paying attention to, particularly given the ongoing climate change conference. And Mr. Klepp, certainly EU and Europe plays a significant role there on the issue of climate change. Of course, we understand in the G20 statement, there's one country that does not necessarily subscribe to that specific paragraph, but rather prefer to talk about the energy. Having said that, though, it is a joint statement, and therefore it is going to have a huge impact on the mood and the mode of cooperation on that issue. Mr. Klepp.
Well, countries are indeed trying to implement the climate agreement of Paris, and it's well known that US President Trump stands very critically to that. I'm not sure where this is all going to end, to be honest. I think we have set something in motion where countries will try to slip under their obligations. I think it also has something to do with the fact that many of these obligations do basically not enjoy wide support, and not only among ordinary people. If you look at the protests in France against ever higher fuel taxes, but also among policymakers. Many of the measures that have been taken, for example in Europe, have actually been hijacked by special interests that are more than happy with ever more climate regulations because they have already done the investment, whereas their competitors have not. In particular, the European ETS system is in at least dire need of reform, and perhaps it may be better to just scrap it all together and try to start from scratch.
All right, Mr. Gao, what about that? Climate change, will China, with the participation of Chinese President Xi Jinping there at the G20 Summit and finally a joint declaration, will that impact China's approach eventually about how to work with the others on the climate change issue?
No, I think as far as climate change is concerned, all the countries in the world, including China, need to think the right thing, say the right thing, and do the right thing, and walk the right walk. And there are countries which are not doing the right thing, not walking the right walk, and not even talking the right talk, and thinking very, very differently. And I think that's dangerous for mankind as a whole. China, as expressed by President Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders, have firmly committed to do whatever it is obligated to do under the Paris Accord, and I have no doubt that China will perform fully its obligations and really set a good example for the rest of the world, especially after the United States under President Donald Trump has pulled out of the accord to the dissatisfaction of the rest of the world.
If you look at China's immediate goal by the year 2020, one of it is to deal with the environmental degradation it is facing right now. If you look at the air quality and things like that, this is really a bottom-up approach together with a top-down approach happening at the same time. Having said that, though, Mr. Redrado, you also noticed that with the G20 joint declaration, which is supposed to be the annual declaration in a way to impact on some of the most important economies in the world, there are things about financing, there are things about the global economy, where is it going under the current so-called trade war environment, not just between China and the United States, but also among some of the other economies as well. There's also talking about the infrastructure and funding of it. Mr. Redrado, how much can we expect that the G20 joint declaration be implemented by all the economies, sign on to it?
Well, obviously there is a hard task ahead in terms of implementation. In my view, and as former governor of a central bank that has been an active member in the G20, the work of this group has been very effective when we had a crisis, and that was in 2009. I hope that we could prevent a next recession by implementing, in particular, the right monetary policies. I looked at one positive wording in the final declaration, which is that monetary policy should sustain growth and then price stability. So we put growth in front of price stability, given that, in my view, and also it is gaining the view that inflation is not such a big a concern as some of my colleagues are seeing it in the US. So as long as we have a low pace of high interest rates, this will benefit the world economy and in particular emerging markets.
You know, a lot of people really need to read this joint declaration very closely, because there are a lot of stuff in it that will have an impact, we hope, for the economies that sign on to it. Having said that, though, there are also bilateral meetings and also bilateral visits made by Chinese President Xi Jinping during his 9-day tour. And Dr. Gao, one of it, of course, is the working dinner with U.S. President Donald Trump. Today we have heard also a statement coming from the Chinese Commerce Department, Ministry rather, talking about the 90-day grace period between the two countries when it comes to how the negotiations and under what framework the negotiations will be done. Mr. Gao, China pretty much is quite in line with Washington now about the agenda, but the thing is, how can two sides implement it?
Well, first of all, whatever China and the United States agreed to do is a good news. It was well received not only in China but also in the United States, but also on the global capital markets. Secondly, we congratulate President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping for the courage and wisdom in doing the right thing, at least for this round of their meeting and the negotiations. Now, thirdly, I think 90 days to come to finish up all the negotiations to avoid the more imposition of tariffs on Chinese export to the United States, for example, is really a daunting task. And I think the two governments really need to do whatever they can to figure out the best way to narrow their differences and pull off the final result, which will be good for China, will be good for the United States. And we really need to urge both governments and their negotiating teams to fully engage with each other to avoid a catastrophe, which will be a full-blown trade war between China and the United States.
One of the things is how, right? Isn't it, Mr. Gupta, how? I mean, 3 months, nothing, you know, hugely significant can be finished within just a small time frame of 3 months. We all understand that. In between, there's the Christmas, there's New Year, there's Chinese New Year, so a lot of holidays as well. That put a lot of pressure on the working group on the both sides.
Yes, indeed, that does place a lot of pressure on both sides. And I would not see necessarily the 90-day deadline as being sacrosanct. You know, these are issues which they have been discussing for the past 5 years and have not made significant progress on. But if we can have substantial progress within the 90-day window, I think the process can move forward positively. I am very, very encouraged by the fact that at that meeting, at that dinner, it was President Xi who took the initiative in talking specifics of the plans and the reforms that China wishes to introduce, both on the structural and non-structural elements, primarily the structural elements with regard to its joint venture law and its investment regime. This was not delegated to even Vice Premier Liu He. It was the President himself who spoke in extraordinary detail, and this really left an impression on people at the table there. Both Secretary Mnuchin and National Economic Council Director Kudlow being really taken aback very positively. So I am hoping that right now, at this 40th anniversary of China's reform initiative, China is ready to make that next big step forward.
Well, Dr. Gao, I want to come back to you about that too. I mean, it is not just the Chinese President Xi Jinping, but also the U.S. President Donald Trump. They both personally took the initiative and talk in details about some of the very specific issues of concerns to both sides. So you see top diplomacy in play, really. But at the same time, there has to be a whole layer of interactions to go on, you know, to make things happen at different areas. So very briefly from you, Dr. Gao.
Well, first of all, I think the United States need to realize that tariffs are not easy to win, and tariffs cut both ways. It's bad for China, it's bad for the United States.
Absolutely. They're already the market plunge we have seen so far.
Secondly, there are deep problems between China and the United States in trade and economic relations and otherwise, and these problems demand solutions, and it takes two to tango. China and the United States need to negotiate very amicably, hopefully treat each other as equals rather than get to each other's throats, for example, and accuse each other and condemn each other. And I think we need a good atmosphere for China and the United States to really get to the bottom of these issues and coming up with mutually satisfactory solutions.
That would be good for everybody, including for the rest of the world. Talking about the rest of the world, Mr. Redrado and also Mr. Klepp, we have noticed that the Chinese President Xi Jinping also made a state visit to Latin America, to countries, Panama, Argentina, and also to some of the European countries, Spain and Portugal. Some talk about the multilateral approach that China is trying to re-establish or help to establish. And how do you see those trips, in a way, help the world to clarify what China is thinking? Mr. Redrado, briefly.
We are looking forward to further engagement of China in Latin America. My view is that this should be a very balanced approach. That is to say that any investment that China wants to make, and all the agreements that were signed between President Macri from Argentina and President Xi Jinping, strengthening the strategic relation that it has between China and Argentina, but also with other countries in Latin America, really create jobs. That's the key question for our countries. How do we improve the capacity of our workers? And therefore, my view is that China should always have a balanced approach.
Okay.
In some cases, what we had is Chinese companies buying into Argentine traders, and then they shut down plants for crushing of soybean. That's not the approach that should be taken. More balance, more to create jobs, more infrastructure. That is highly welcome by all of Latin American countries.
All right, and very briefly also from you, Mr. Klepp, about the European countries.
Well, there's an increasing amount of skepticism in Europe about Chinese investment in Europe. In a way, that's of course unfortunate. Europe should be happy with investment, but I think the problem is that a lot of the Chinese economy is still controlled by the government, so Europeans are saying, okay, fine, we are happy to allow competition, to allow investment, but then if we do not allow the governments of Europe to mingle into the European economy, why should we allow the Chinese government?
Right.
What is the way forward? I think the way forward is very simple. If China liberalizes, if China reduces the role of its government system into the economy, then these concerns will, of course, also disappear.
Okay, two things. China is on a learning curve. First time, 200 years, to be able to be one of those important players in the world, how to do things with the rest of the world. Secondly, how to communicate with the rest of the world. Meanwhile, it does also take learning from the other countries to understand China, not just put down demands on China. So, Dr. Gao, final words from you before we go.
Well, I think indeed it takes two to tango. China needs to understand the rest of the world better, but the rest of the world also need to understand what's really going on in China.
That's right.
There are many countries which have state-owned enterprises. Singapore Airlines is a state-owned enterprise. I don't care whether it's privately owned or state-owned. I care about the service and the quality of the service of the airline. That should be the real litmus test, rather than whether it's state-owned for Singapore Air or Cathay Pacific, which is privately owned.
Okay. A name tag is not necessarily the nature of things, but rather what is the real essence of things. Thank you so much for the four of you helping us, very fast speed to understand the latest developments so far. Victor Gao Zhikai, Saurabh Gupta, Peter Klepp, and Martin Redrado. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it.